This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global medtech community at mystrategist.com.
Hi, this is Steve Levin, editor with Medtech Strategist and Market Pathways, and I want to welcome everyone to another edition of our Market Pathways podcast. Today, we're going to tackle one of the most widely discussed issues on the Medtech reimbursement front, and that is the need for an expedited Medtech reimbursement process or pathway. With this discussion comes a couple of new acronyms because, of course, we don't have enough acronyms in the medical device world. And I'm talking specifically about MCIT, MCIT, Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, a program that was recently repealed, and then its subsequent or possible successor program, which is referred to as TCET, TCET, standing for Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technologies. And I can't think of a better guest to have to explain these programs, which of course involve both FDA and CMS, than Mark McClellan. Mark, of course, served as both the CMS administrator and the commissioner at FDA. So we'll look forward to Mark's views both on MCIT, TCET, and other reimbursement issues facing the medical device industry. We hope you enjoy the podcast. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mark McClellan to the Market Pathways podcast. And I think Mark is a name familiar to most people in our industry. He has the distinction of having served as both CMS administrator and the commissioner at FDA. And now Mark is director, among the many hats that he wears, director of the Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke. And Mark, why don't we start, for those who aren't familiar with the Margolis Center, maybe talk a little bit about what the center does, and then in particular, maybe highlight what you're doing in the medtech space.
Sure, Stephen. And first of all, thanks for the opportunity. It's good to be with you and your listeners. Our program at Duke Margolis is a university-wide center that focuses on improving healthcare, health equity for all Americans, and actually has programs now that have a global reach. We're university-wide, meaning that we draw on faculty from throughout Duke. Our main offices on campus are actually located in the business school. We also have a number of affiliated professors in public policy, medicine, nursing, have collaborations with engineering and many other schools at Duke as well. And we also have a number of our staff, some of our faculty based primarily in our Washington, D.C. office. Mm-hmm. That gives us a good opportunity for working with not only government agencies, Congress on policy issues, and many of the stakeholders that are based in Washington, but a good opportunity for convening different perspectives from across the industry, patient groups, others on some of the key policy issues out there. And we're very much intending to be a group that, and now 5 years in, I think we are a group that can both help develop new analysis and new evidence, some of those academic publications and that sort of thing. But we don't want to stop there. We want to help with practical implementation issues. And that includes issues related to biomedical technologies, various types of medical devices. We have a big program in artificial intelligence. But it really is a broad-based program reflecting our university-wide focus and the breadth of our mission.
Great. Today, this is particularly timely. I want to spend really most of our conversation talking about reimbursement and most prominently I hate to throw acronyms out there, but focusing on the MCIT/TSET issue. And let me start by suggesting that if we were having this kind of conversation a decade ago or 8 years ago, and I was out talking to large medtech strategics or medtech startups, they would have said to me, the number one challenge facing our industry is the regulatory situation. And I think that, you laid a lot of the foundation, and then Jeff Shuren at CDRH stepped in. And I think it's safe to say there's a consensus that the situation at FDA has improved dramatically. And I want to touch later on the whole issue of resources that have been devoted and why that's improved. And I think what has replaced regulatory in the minds of most medtech executives is reimbursement, and that's become kind of the number one issue facing medtech companies. And so I think the whole discussion about the issue of MCIT and then TSET, should it take its place, is particularly timely. So let's kind of lay the foundation. MCIT itself went through a really kind of roller coaster type situation as far as when it was adopted and then ultimately repealed. And I'd be interested in your take on whether you thought repealing MCIT was necessary. Could the regulation have been fixed in terms of, making certain changes to address some of the problems that were highlighted, for example, from a Medicare safety perspective, or was it better to start from scratch?
I do think some significant revisions were needed and have been helpful. And I think what this process has taught all of us is that while the challenges that many product developers who are working really hard to get to FDA approval, the challenges they feel out there once they reach that benchmark and still, look ahead and then see an unclear path, maybe the payment and adoption and the like. Those are real challenges. But I think we've gotten a refined understanding of both what exactly the challenges are and what some of the most promising steps are to address them. And I think the evolution from the initial MCIT proposal to TSET and to recognition that, those phrases, those acronyms both have as a second key word, coverage, recognize that the issues around, it's not really about reimbursement by itself. It's not really about coverage, which is only a step on the path to effective reimbursement. It's really about effective uptake and use of potential breakthrough or transformative technologies. And there are a number of dimensions of that extend beyond the approval process. It certainly includes coverage, but it also includes other, kind of mundane but really critical details, like getting coding in a timely way so that the product can get billing, and then having a benefit category in Medicare and private insurance or other plans where that device fits. Some of the breakthrough devices moving along now, including maybe some of the early, advanced diagnostic technologies. Those don't automatically have a clear and easy home in Medicare. Right. The Medicare benefit structure was designed in the 1960s, and it wasn't really about prevention and early detection so much as it was, how do you fix something that's broken? And that's not where medicine is today. And then beyond that, there are even with coverage and payment, if the payment models aren't right for the technology, if maybe they don't reflect value well, a lot of device payments, again, I'll give a diagnostic example, are based on, some effort to estimate costs, but this really ought to be about value too. So maybe the payment systems have some issues. And then finally, with many of these breakthrough devices, the fact is they're going to get better over their life cycle. Many of them are devices where they might be an implant that's going to be with you literally for years, if not the rest of your life. And in the studies that can be done in a pre-market setting, well, it's just very hard to get that long-term data to understand what the side effect profile over time might be. Does it need replacement or something like that? Many of these complex devices get better with experience. It's true with experience on the surgeon side, the person who's doing the implantation or the procedure. It's true on the device side as feedback from users and patients. The design can be improved. And it's increasingly true on the technology side with, data being increasingly captured about medical devices. It can go into AI and robotics adds a level of, I think some people think of it as, fine control technology, but it's really about capturing a whole lot of data and bringing that to bear on how exactly a device might be used. All of those things are going to evolve over time, not to mention the diversity of patients that might benefit from a technology, et cetera. And I think in the MCIT and the TCET processes, we may have early on got a little bit focused just on coverage and not on all these other issues related to the evolution of the device itself, the payment issues and coding and the experience and confidence that patients and doctors have in the device. And I think some of the later iterations of this proposal recognize that by not every breakthrough device is going to need a fast and rapid new process for a pathway to coverage. The vast majority of medical products that get approved, devices, drugs, otherwise, don't have a Medicare coverage decision. Some of them may not have a clear process through the local coverage decisions. That may need some additional attention, or maybe they need a national coverage decision. Those are areas where you'd like to focus the resources of a TCET type of program. But with other devices, it may be other issues. It may be questions about the quality of the evidence. It may be issues about whether a Medicare benefit category exists, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm hoping is going to come out of this is a much sharper understanding of what's the right needs for a particular product that might be plowing new ground, and not just assume that an automatic coverage process is going to solve the key problems in unlocking the value and getting appropriate and effective access to that technology.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
One of the challenges, and you've alluded to parts of this, is that when we talk about, for example, the difference between regulatory and reimbursement is, for as Byzantine as some people may have considered the FDA approval process or clearance process, you're dealing with a single agency. In terms of the reimbursement landscape, broadly writ, you're dealing not only with coverage, coding, and payment. You're not only dealing with CMS, you're dealing with the MACs, you're dealing with the private insurers, you're dealing with, the AMA in the case of coding. So, I mean, there's a lot of participants, a lot of moving parts. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I am interested in, and you've touched on this, one of I think the big issues that perhaps is not getting or is not well understood enough is the whole area of access gaps. And that whole issue, and under the current process, the use of I hate to use another acronym, but I'll just say coverage with evidence development, CED, and the challenges that presents in terms of, while it ensures Medicare access, it really requires a national coverage decision. And you look at the medtech industry, where a lot of the innovation comes from smaller startup companies, they may not have the infrastructure that's necessary to go ahead and do that. Can you just talk a little bit about that whole issue of access gaps, the problems that are currently existing, and how might that be addressed by a future proposal?
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying that national coverage decisions are a big production, and I can understand, especially for a company that hasn't gone through it before, how that might seem daunting. I do think that for smaller companies, again, those who haven't been through it, as you said, it's a very complex environment out there involving MACs, the local coverage decision makers that are probably most important in traditional Medicare for most devices, involving the AMA and the coding process, increasingly involving other payers. Just to put things in perspective, this year we'll probably see Medicare transition from the point of more people being in Medicare Advantage, the private plans in Medicare, if they've got Part A and Part B coverage, than in traditional Medicare. The MA part has been growing really rapidly, and the MA plans have their own coverage reviews, and they have to follow Medicare guidance. But in terms of things like utilization review and evidence expectations and standards, those can be different. So all of that can seem pretty daunting, and understandably so. I do think something that can help in the case of the national coverage decisions is clarity about when those will be needed, since that is a big point in itself. And one of the things that I see is one of the potential benefits of the MCIT or TCIT as it's evolving is not, this golden ticket to automatic coverage in Medicare. And again, as we've just been talking about, coverage by itself may not be your biggest problem, and often isn't, but rather the importance of having a process for early engagement with CMS, and maybe by extension, since CMS is still the biggest player, some opportunities for perspectives from some of these other payers and experiences on just what is going to complicate access to a new, very promising technology, assuming it gets through the FDA approval process well. And as we've talked about, there are a number of things that can cause it. One of those things is concern about whether the evidence available on that new technology meets the CMS standards for being reasonable and necessary for coverage. And that's typically where the national coverage decision process with coverage with evidence development has come in. CMS has used that process in cases where there are important questions about the safety or effectiveness of a technology in the Medicare population. And that can happen for devices, for example, if the clinical trials involved only certain types of centers with lots of experience, or only certain types of patients with few comorbidities and maybe younger and less diverse, or situations where, like I said, you'd expect the technology to get better over time. And in those cases, for example, for TAVR technology, for the transaortic valve replacement and some of the other transcutaneous procedures for valves, back in my day when I was at CMS, for implantable cardioverter defibrillators, those coverage with evidence development processes enabled Medicare to cover more broadly, more quickly than it would have otherwise, because it had a registry process in place for addressing and getting some more post-market evidence on those safety issues, or on effects in different subgroups of patients, or on the impact of operator experience or facility experience, and really help refine our understanding to the point that there's a pathway for many of those transaortic technologies for much broader use with much more confidence among doctors and patients. Remember that confidence is the ultimate thing that really is going to drive access and broad uptake of a technology, and that's where CED can come in. I would just say one more thing about the coverage with evidence process is that it's been a good deal of work to get there. These processes are best, I think, if they start well before approval, and that happened in some of the cases that I described. So then there's a good understanding, maybe even infrastructure in place by the time a product is approved. So it's not going to lead to a significant delay, and there's broader coverage involved. But I think we also have some new opportunities to take advantage of digital technologies, more advanced electronic records, direct from patient information, direct from device information that could potentially really bring down the costs of registry in the post-market setting. And we're seeing tons more use of so-called real-world evidence now on medical devices. Most of it's not formal CED, but a lot of it's still really useful for addressing these further questions about, how should we be using this technology? Should coverage change or expand in some way? And I hope we can keep using this process for making more progress there. And that might bring me to the point about resources that I did really want to make sure we got to during our time together.
I want to get to that, and I apologize for interrupting, but this was a great segue into my next question, which is the importance of post-market evidence generation and the use of real-world evidence. One, and you're familiar with the recent study that came out of Stanford Biodesign. One of the concerns from the industry perspective is that companies were saying, well, we're doing that anyway. Now, again, that may or may not be true, but talk about the role of post-market evidence generation generally, and then specifically the use of real-world evidence. Is that something that regulators have gotten comfortable using? How big of a leap will that be?
Yeah, I think real-world evidence is an area that is going to be increasingly important, particularly for medical devices. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH at FDA, was an early pioneer and a broad user of real-world evidence. I think that gets back to, like we were talking about, the nature of many medical devices, where unlike a pill or a molecule, the molecule is what it is. There's still a lot more evidence around it. That's where the main value is, and still a value from real-world evidence there too. But especially for the medical devices, they just keep getting better. I mean, they have a life cycle to them where operator experience, the software and other data components around the technology or design changes in the technology itself can matter. And so much of the regulatory process, 510K, et cetera, already reflects building on that predicate evidence, even for the next devices that come along. Well, that really suggests that the better we can do at developing evidence from real-world practice, how clinicians and how patients are experiencing these devices, is even more important than in other sectors of medicine. So the regulatory appreciation is there. I would say that the clinical and payer appreciation is there too. I think there's still many more opportunities ahead to make it easier to collect data on a device, on a patient's outcomes, and in routine clinical settings. Some of the other work that we do at the center, for example, focuses on new ways of designing clinical care models for back pain or degenerative joint disease, where built into the model is much more attention to how a patient's functional status is responding, and not something that we that CMS routinely collects as part of its usual payment systems. But, the most important thing to a patient, probably the most important thing to a patient with back pain or knee pain or something like that. And learning more about how devices actually function from a patient standpoint, huge opportunities there that I think this push towards more real world evidence and towards CMS and for that matter, other payers and clinicians facilitating easier ways to collect valid real world data, to understand the methods that can be used to learn more about products in actual practice. That's what's going to make the regulatory process go more smoothly. And it's really going to get to my point about, look, what people want to pay for is a device that really works for them. And the more we can create confidence through better evidence, especially real-world evidence about that, the better for the device industry.
So that's a perfect segue into what you had started to talk about, which is resources. And the ironic thing about resources is that we've seen tremendous growth in that area on the FDA front through really a bipartisan effort. I know that's a dirty word these days to talk about bipartisan support for something, but in terms of the Cures Act, in terms of user fees, it's really been successful and I think we've seen the results of that at FDA. You also know better than anyone the concerns about CMS, where we've actually seen resources decline, over a similar period of time. That's something that's hard for industry executives to grasp. Is there an explanation that you have as to why we seem to be moving forward on one front and not on the other? And are you optimistic that we can somehow, especially given the pandemic and all the budgetary constraints that we're facing, that we can see some progress coming forward at CMS?
Yeah, it's a bit hard for me to grasp too, Stephen, that we've seen so much progress in so many areas of medtech innovation in terms of the diversity of devices out there, nanotechnologies. I mentioned robotics, big data-driven, AI-driven devices, and lots of other dimensions, regenerative medicine integrated with devices. And yet the CMS resources, the entire coverage division that oversees these kind of technical reviews of whether or not a treatment is reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries, that office probably shrunk by 40% than when I was there, 15 years ago. And that's just the opposite direction that the complexity of technology is moving. And so you see that reflected in just how stretched the CMS staff is. I would say this is a couple of key points, especially for device manufacturers who have, answered these surveys and have some worries, apprehensions, don't seem to have a clear path forward. If you have questions, I really do encourage you to reach out to the CMS staff in that coverage division. It's the division of the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality. CCSQ is the name of it. Earlier on, maybe even before your clinical trials are done, they try to be very receptive with questions. They'll tell you what category or what kinds of resources are available for you. I know many of the device manufacturers still feel like, well, that still leaves me with some questions about where exactly does my device or test or other product fit in.
So kind of like the equivalent of pre-submission meetings. Because I have to say that's a great suggestion, Mark, because I would dare say that most industry folks don't really even know that option is available to them.
It is available. It's just not nearly as formalized as it is with FDA, because with FDA, as you know, what went along with the user fees, which, had some controversy in the beginning, but went along with them was not, you didn't get slam dunk automatic positive decision on your product. You did get some clear expectations about meetings early, as you said, and an expectation that if there were some questions that were likely to come up later, you'd be able to anticipate them to avoid delays and complications later. And whether it's around, a fast path to getting the right CPT codes assigned, or a question about, is there a Medicare benefit category for my device? Or what I think will be the case for most technologies. Okay, here's the pathway for coverage, and here's a pathway to payment. You may not exactly like it, but it is, that's what it is. At least it's clear. Having that kind of clarity opportunities for MedTech, I think, is increasingly important. And, going into the same kinds of approaching these issues at CMS and with other payers and with post-market evidence in the same way as the industry approached addressing these pre-market developments and related regulatory issues, decade, 15 years ago, I think has a lot of lessons to help with accelerating progress and not for much money. I mean, the size of the CMS office that handles these issues, a few $1 million per year, a little bit of appropriations. I don't even think you need user fees. I mean, this is just something that's a good government. A little bit of appropriations would go a long way.
Right. I wanted to ask you just one last question on the TSET, and then just a quick wrap up. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but there has been a discussion about perhaps the need to codify the definition of reasonable and necessary. Do you think that's something that would help kind of smooth this path going forward and clarify perhaps some questions, or are there other means to achieve that?
I think probably the first step, Stephen, is just having some effort, some joint effort, hopefully some resources behind clarifying what reasonable and necessary means in different contexts. I had the privilege of doing an event last week, a Duke Margolis event with Lee Fleischer, who heads this coverage office at CMS, and Janet Woodcock, Deputy Commissioner at FDA, where people seem to agree was that while many technologies, including MedTech devices, can get through without the coverage process without complications and everything that goes along with it, there are those unusual cases, or maybe there are usual cases in a new area where there isn't that clarity. And I think first would be to look at, how well can we answer those questions? Remember, when Congress codifies things, it has a hard time keeping up with the change that may be coming in the future. So Congress codified, in 1965, what Medicare covered, which made it very difficult to cover devices that are involved in diagnosing and preventing health problems really early on before, something's actually wrong with an organ or a body part, which is what the 1960s language looks like. So I just be cautious about that and think there's a lot of opportunity for close attention, especially in cases where there may be questions, to get to a clearer path forward.
As someone who's generally optimistic, I'm curious, do you see this MCIT/TSET as an opportunity for FDA and CMS to continue to work more closely together? I'm not going to say the words parallel review, but you know where I'm going with that. Is that a silver lining to all the debates surrounding this?
I think we've seen some good examples of that early input when manufacturers want to do it. So these are voluntary steps that we've been talking about. The extra meetings at FDA, the early contact with CMS, are voluntary steps that maybe manufacturers feel like we got this, we understand the process, no big questions, they're going to plow ahead. But if that's not the boat you're in, I think these are promising approaches, and I think having some resources to support them and having some expectations around them, much as has been done on the FDA side, would be helpful. I don't think user fees are needed. I don't think it's that extensive of a process. I think some additional appropriations for CMS, though, could go a long way towards bringing down this uncertainty level.
Great. Well, Mark, great to talk with you, and thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast with Mark McClellan. We hope you enjoyed it, and we encourage you to go back and listen to previous Market Pathways podcasts that are in our podcast archives, and also go to our website, mystrategist.com, to get more information on both Market Pathways and MedTech Strategist. Thanks again for listening.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.